road to autonomy economy. I'm Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to welcome back Mazen Danaf, senior economist and applied scientist, Uber Freight. Mazen, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Grayson. Good to see you again.
It's great to have you here. I got to give you a shout out before we start. You run one of the most interesting X accounts. It's at Freight Econ. You post really great economic data on freight. We're all about economics. And now that I've got your plug for your X account again, and I recommend everybody sign up and subscribe to it. Mazen, what impact is consumer spending having on the freight market?
A lot of impact. That's a short answer. The long answer is that it has been having a very huge impact since the beginning of the pandemic. COVID threw consumer spending all over the place when it started. So at first, consumers were very scared to consume anything. And then they started consuming a lot, staying at home, making their own food, buying their treadmills, their furniture. So that's when we saw spending increase a lot. And then a stimulus came into their hands. So they had the means to consume more. That's when we saw spending really spike in March 2021. After that, spending has stagnated. So the economy started to reopen 2022, the services economy specifically. So consumers shifted that spending from goods to services. So we saw that was one of the reasons that caused the freight recession. And we saw this period of weakness from let's say 2022 until the 2023, early 2023. But then in 2023, we started seeing the opposite. So we started seeing some signs of recovery in spending, especially when we look at consumer spending on goods. So I think if you look at the data from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, it shows that spending has increased about 5% between December and 2022 and December 2023. And that's even after adjusting for inflation. So that's what we call real spending on goods has increased by 5% year over year. Now, today's data shows that January was a drop. So it's a drop about 0.6%. But that would still keep us in the growth mode of about 4% range growth, which is the historical growth mode. So spending is doing well right now. It's been recovering after 2 years of stagnation. And that's good news for the freight market. It means that there's more goods to be moved. Consumers are still buying stuff, and particularly they're buying the big ticket items like motor vehicles, furniture again. So they're buying these expensive items, which is good news for freight.
It's good news for freight. We had the recent earnings from Airbnb. We had the recent earnings from Marriott, and they all pointed to a slowdown in travel spending. There was a lot of reports. Bloomberg did a lot of data analysis, S&P Capital IQ, Reuters, they called it revenge spending. Well, I'm going to go travel the world and I'm going to run up my credit card and let's see what happens. Then Marriott and Airbnb said, whoa, we're preparing for a slowdown there. And then this is scary. U.S. consumer credit card debt is currently $1.13 trillion. That's trillion with a T, not a billion. That's trillion. The average credit card balance is $6,360, an all-time high. 90-day delinquencies are starting to increase. Are you concerned about the growing consumer debt with a high interest rate environment where the consumer has to, quote unquote, service their debt, where they might cut back on goods?
I would say it's there's some worrying signs, but I wouldn't say the sky is falling. So I'd like first to touch on your point on Airbnb. Many would be surprised by this, but if we look at consumer spending on goods, it has outpaced spending on services in the past 12 months. So this is not something that we expected to see. That shows how robust spending on goods has been before maybe today's retail sales report again. So back to the credit card delinquencies and the credit card debt. I was looking at the data this week, and I think we can't look at this in isolation and how much debt there is in isolation, like a trillion number, whether that's billions or trillions. I like to look at consumers' ability to pay that debt. And one way to do so is to normalize it by income. So if you look at the debt to the personal income ratio or the disposable income ratio, you get these from two different sources. You can get the credit card debt from the Federal Reserve. You can go to the BEA to get data on the income, and then you divide them by each other. So let's say that ratio, I think, from the great financial crisis until today, that ratio was around 5%. It was going from the high 4s to the low 5s, but in general, that has been around 5%. And then we have COVID, and with COVID came a huge stimulus, so consumers were really flush with cash. And then that cash helped them a lot to reduce their credit card debt, of course. So that ratio went down from 5% to about 3.5% to 4%. And it stayed in the 4% range for a year or two. But then, since then, there's no more stimulus. Consumers are consuming the remaining savings, the COVID savings. So both the income and the debt have been increasing. And that ratio has been gradually returning back to the 5% level. So it is still at 5%. It is not like 6%. I would be more worried if it was 6%, higher than the pre-COVID era. But it's still at 5% right now. It has just returned back to 5%. That's a good news. The bad news is that it has been growing from 40% to 5%. It might grow more. Who knows? Delinquencies have been rising a little bit from maybe like 2.7% to 3%. Again, this is not like a sky is falling scenario, but it's slightly higher than where it used to be pre-COVID, which is 2.7%. So there are some worrying signs, I would say, but not like a catastrophic scenario yet.
I agree. And then potential. This is potential. I'm not a Fed watcher, so I'm going to highlight this as potential. In the back half of the year, the Fed could potentially cut interest rates, which could ease the credit card payments because it would technically lower the interest rate. So I've studied a lot about the credit card markets and consumer spending, and I want to ask you this. What impact do you think of the aggressiveness of the marketing of the rewards programs is having on this aspect of the consumer debt? Because, spend $10,000, get 100,000 bonus points. Oh, I got to do it. I got to do it. Or spend this, go on travel, get these rewards. And as you and I both know, you know this better than me because you're a real economist. I'm just a wannabe economist. Is that points devalue over time? You're not buying an asset that appreciates. You're buying a devaluing asset. What impact do you think that this whole culture towards rewards has had on the growing debt?
Definitely. Like there's a lot of behavioral psychology in there or behavioral economics going into that. So that's a specific field in economics, which I'm not an expert in, but I can speak from personal experience at least. It has an effect on me.
It has an effect on everybody. As I said earlier, the Fed potentially could cut interest rates in the back half of the year. I don't believe that they're going to cut in March because inflation is not transitory. It's very, very sticky. If the Fed does cut in the back half of the year, what are you looking for in the market? What signs are you looking for in the freight? Will consumers go back to continuing to spend on goods? Will they save? Where do you think this is going to go?
So the first question I've asked myself, is the Fed cutting rates because it can cut rates or because it has to cut rates? So hopefully it'll be cutting rates because it can cut rates, not because something wrong is going with their economy. And by that, I mean like mostly unemployment, like a spike in unemployment. When we look at unemployment, it doesn't go up smoothly. So it doesn't increase gradually, like 0.1 percentage point every month or so during a recession. It just spikes. And that's what worries me about this. So hopefully we'll go into a soft landing scenario, which is becoming the more likely scenario now, but with a great question mark around that because we don't know how employment rates behave in the long term. So that's the first thing I'll be looking at. Like, is unemployment still under control? Is the consumer still in good shape? Because that determines the downstream consumption of goods. That's what drives freight demand. The second thing I'll be looking at is what's happening in the housing sector. So housing has been one of the key factors that have resulted in this freight recession that we're in today. By that, I'm not only referring to the construction materials or the construction activities that drive a lot of trucking activity, but also think about the broader goods economy, like furniture, appliances, garden supplies, everything we buy when we move into a new home. So these are all affected and these are all driving the freight recession. So coming out of this recession, looking at like what will happen to new home sales, to existing home sales, that will determine how quickly the freight market will recover. And finally, of course, manufacturing. We have seen a slowdown in manufacturing over the last 2 years. Part of that was driven by inventories, but part of that was driven by also high interest rates. One of the indicators I like to watch is the manufacturing loans or the industrial loans. And these have been stagnant over the last couple of years, maybe because rates were higher. So maybe if the rates get low again, we'll see more investment in manufacturing again, which is also good news for freight.
Are you concerned about the commercial real estate market? We're seeing signs of weakness across the globe, not just in the United States.
So the United States has been doing better in the overall economy than the rest of the globe. It's been leading the rest of the economy. And when we look at the rest of the global economy, when we look specifically at real estate, it seems to me that the worst is behind us in terms of housing starts, building permits, and even like home sales, new home sales. It seems that the worst is behind us. So I'm more optimistic than concerned just because like when we're looking at the data, it seems that we have passed that trough, unless we have like a W-shaped behavior of that. But so far, the data is pointing that the worst is behind us.
That's a positive. I think one thing that could benefit the housing market, and I'll get a lot of pushback here. Well, certain individuals are locked in extremely low mortgage rates, but we had the lawsuit and went to the Missouri Supreme Court. It's making its way to the U.S. Supreme Court around real estate commissions. If the Supreme Court invalidates real estate commissions, you're eliminating 6% of the value of selling a home that could potentially open up the housing market pretty substantially. If you're losing that 6% commission you have to pay, that could be interesting to see what homes come on the market. It's both from an economic standpoint, but a psychological standpoint where there's a lot of individuals that don't want to pay real estate fees. If that happens and the Supreme Court says no more real estate fees, that they're no more fixed, could that help this housing market really start to take off as consumers feel, I would say, I'm going to use the term, more comfortable perhaps?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. A lot of this is psychological as well. So even when you look at mortgage rates themselves, like a lot of that is psychological. Maybe like when you compare, for example, 3% to 6%, it's a bad thing to do. Like no one's going to buy a home at 6%. Until rates go up to 7%, 8%, and then they come back to 6%, and then suddenly the 6% looks good. So a lot of this is psychological, and I definitely think it might be one of the factors.
It's psychological. I'll give you another psychological factor. Every day I open the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, or I turn on Bloomberg. Layoffs across the board, and they're by the thousands. So I took that, and I'm just being my own little economist here. I started correlating that data with spring break hotspots for adults with families, not Cancun, not Mexico, but where you would go skiing in St. Moritz, or you would go with your family to the Caribbean. Also, like two things I've noticed. One, availability. Two, discounts. The discounts for spring break are picking up. Could we attribute some of that to the job market of some of this slowdown in the layoffs? Do you think that's giving that flexibility there?
That's interesting to me because when you look at the layoffs on a larger scale, on the scale of the whole economy, it hasn't increased yet. We have seen all of these layoffs in some sectors in tech, maybe like in freight, because there's like a freight recession, freight tech, but we haven't seen like broader layoffs in the whole economy. If you look at data from the JOLT survey, yes, job openings are down, hiring is down, but layoffs are not increasing. So there is this whole sentiment around layoffs and that layoffs are increasing, but the data is not showing that. There's also like a lot of, like when you look at consumer sentiment, it has decreased a lot, even though unemployment was still good. The consumer was still in good shape. What was driving it lower? Maybe like gas prices. That was one of the primary factors. Is gas prices is it enough to push consumer spending down to like historical lows? I don't know, but as you're saying, a lot of this is just psychological.
There's a lot of psychological here. We're going to learn a lot as we go into later months of the year. We're going to have you back to discuss when we have more data to discuss. Now we're speculating, but I'm going to get back. I'm going to stop speculating here for a moment. I'm going to get back to the data. You publish these great freight economist updates, and I want to quote some data out of your January 2024 update. In your January 2024 update, you noted that wages in the long-distance truckload sector fell 0.5%. Ending 2023 at 1.5% growth, compared to 8% growth in 2022. What's causing this decline in job growth?
It is just a freight market. So think about there's a supply and demand for drivers, and that's what determines drivers' wages. In 2022, the supply was very low because the market was still tight back then. Drivers preferred to work on their own instead of getting enrolled with carriers. They still prefer to obtain their own authorities, to operate their own authorities as like owner-operators, or maybe build their own companies. And then that caused a shortage of drivers on the carrier side, on the big carrier side. They had to increase wages to attract these drivers back. Also, the demand was really high because there was a lot of demand for goods. We weren't in the middle of this freight recession yet. So the supply was lower, demand was higher. We saw an 8% growth in wages. In 2023, it was the opposite story. So we were in the middle of a freight recession. Demand was low. Carriers have realized that they overhired maybe in the past year, and now demand has plummeted. And then all of the drivers were losing a lot of money in the spot market, so they wanted to return back to the larger carriers. And that is an excess supply. So demand came down, supply came up, and then these carriers realized that maybe they don't have enough incentive to increase these wages. Many of them are trying to decrease the headcount that they already have, so they're not very eager to hire as much as they did in 2022.
Does this yin-yang back and forth tennis rally open the doors potentially for autonomous trucks, for the carriers to really invest in autonomous trucks?
So this low growth in driver wages by itself, it doesn't say much about autonomous trucks. It's a short-term phenomenon that I expect that wages will increase again when the market recovers. I think what autonomous trucks will offer is some level of stability, or like a stable supply that doesn't leave the market when the market is tight and come back when the market is soft. So this stability might be favorable for carriers. But it also eliminates a lot of flexibility as well, because carriers might want to have that flexibility to control their headcount in response to the market. I think in the long term, yes, you're right. Like carriers might want to decide how much they want to trade off stability for flexibility. So they would want to have ideally a mix of human-driven fleets and autonomous fleets, and to optimize that ratio to guarantee that they have enough capacity when the market is tight, but also that they have enough flexibility and they're not keeping money on the table when the market is soft.
Is this where Uber Freight comes into the equation because you offer the flexibility through your platform?
Yeah, so we believe in hybrid networks. We believe that for the years to come, when with the introduction of AV trucks on the network, the need for human drivers will always remain there. So we're working on building this hybrid network. We're working on building all the tools for a hybrid, autonomous, and human-driven network so that drivers and autonomous trucks can work together, can complement each other on the same trips in the hub-to-hub model, but also complement each other on where they operate. Maybe like human drivers are more efficient on some lanes. Maybe AVs are more efficient on some lanes. Yeah, for the long-term future, for the years to come, we still believe that we will be living through this hybrid environment and human drivers will still be needed.
We will be living through this hybrid environment. Uber Freight today publicly stated you have $18 billion of freight under management. Are you using that data to help model lanes for your partners, both on the traditional driving side and the autonomous driving side?
Definitely. That's like probably the number one request we receive from all of our autonomous trucking partners is like, yeah, let's look at your data. Let's know which lanes should we operate on and where to locate transfer hubs. And that's something that we can look at based on how much volume we have on the lanes, based on the rates we have on these lanes, which lanes make sense not only from a volume standpoint, but also from a feasibility standpoint, from a unit economic standpoint, especially when you look at the hub-to-hub model, right? Because you have extra cost for serving the first mile and the last mile. So when does it make sense to invest in a hub-to-hub model for example, it definitely makes more sense on longer lanes than shorter lanes, because that fraction of the first mile and last mile is smaller compared to the total cost. Yeah, that's something we're looking at. The other thing we're looking at is where to locate these terminals for transfer hubs. We have data on shippers' facilities, on warehouses, manufacturing plants. So we know exactly where the freight is coming and where the freight is going. And if you want to minimize that first and last mile cost, you have to look at that. You have to look at like where is the optimal location for my transfer hub or my terminal to make it as close as possible to the freight origins and destinations.
So if you have an interest in autonomous trucking, call Olivia Ho. She runs your autonomous trucking division. Olivia, hi, you're great. She can help you get the data. You can potentially strike a partnership because that data will allow you to optimize your operations. It will increase your efficiency. Mazen, does it all come down to economics when carriers look to implement autonomous trucks in their fleets? Will economics be one of the biggest drivers, if not the biggest driver?
I'd say it's one of the bigger drivers. It depends on what stages are you in. In general, like when you look at the expansion plans of AV players so far, they looked at regulations. These are like very hard constraints, like regulations and weather constraints. You can't escape that. So this will come before economics, especially if you're in the early stages. You're going to work on a short lane just for a pilot, even though the unit economics might not work on that lane. But then in the later stages, yes, of course, economics and unit economics will play a huge role. Rates will determine the feasibility of AV tracking. If you're in an environment like 2023 with like average rates of like $1.60 per mile for an average rate to compete with the rest of the market, it's very different from an environment like 2021 where it was almost $3 per mile. Definitely your unit economics will make more sense. For carriers, they'll feel that they need autonomous trucks more when the market is tight, when drivers are not available, when they're scarce, when they're like trying to escape them to build their own companies or to buy their own trucks. So they will need to invest more in autonomous trucks. Similarly, when the market is soft, they might think that, oh, we have drivers, like we're not paying a lot for freight. We have an abundance of drivers. Do we need to invest in autonomous trucks? Do we really need to invest in autonomous trucks or not? So, of course, it will be a key determinant of the carrier's decisions as well. But I think the clever ones will look at this as like a long-term investment. If I'm planning to optimize a fleet for the long term, because these assets will last for a long time, regardless of the current state of the market, what is the optimal fleet mix of human-driven fleets and autonomous fleets as well?
Look throughout financial markets, there's one thing that everybody can agree on, or I'll say at least 99.9% of individuals can agree on. Long-term investing, long-term strategy planning is the way to go. And you have a look at Berkshire Hathaway there as a very public example of the compounding of long-term benefits and what it's done for economics. I harp on this, and I've spoken to Olivia about this many times. We have to get off for autonomous trucks the Dallas to Houston route. Every time I try and I don't have your data, but I have public data. And every time I try and model the profitability for an autonomous truck to Dallas to Houston, I can't get the economics to work. I can't get the numbers to work. I just can't make a business out of it. So hopefully at some point, once the regulatory environment is stable, you work with your partners. You're very public with Wabi. You're very public with Torque. You're very public with Aurora and your parent company. Uber is an investor both in Wabi and Aurora, that you can give the data to your partners, allow them to build the hubs and go into profitable lanes, because profitable lanes will help create jobs, which will be good, not just for the freight economy, but for the United States economy as a whole. I think a lot about intermodal. What role or how do you see autonomous trucks and intermodal working together?
There's a lot of synergies between autonomous trucks and intermodal. So when you think about like what both will need terminals and both will need drayage. In a perfect world, this will be like benefiting from sharing maybe terminals and benefiting from sharing the same drayage fleets, because when you add more freight to these fleets, they become more efficient. You can keep their schedules busy, you can keep the trucks running all the time. So you can cut costs for both, for intermodal and for autonomous trucks. So that's in a perfect world, which we hope to see happening. In reality, maybe in the far future, once we're beyond this hub-to-hub model, or even in the later stages of that, when we have like the really long hauls, autonomous trucks going for the long hauls, we might see some competition between these two, because they're both competing for like long distance freight. And then autonomous trucks might be cutting the cost significantly. So they might be eliminating one of the advantages of intermodal as well. So I think there's a study by University of Texas at Austin that found exactly that once the introduction of autonomous trucks might take share from intermodal primarily, and then the share of total trucking will increase, the share of intermodal will decrease. There might definitely be some competition there. And then with that, we have to start thinking about the energy efficiency or the emissions of autonomous trucks as well. Like how do we introduce these in an environmental friendly way, especially if we're competing with intermodal, which is a very sustainable mode compared to trucking. How do we not lose on the sustainability front as well?
I'll give you an idea. It's pro-sustainability. A Class 1 railroad buys an autonomous trucking company and extends the railroad and makes it, you want to call it a digital railroad, an autonomous railroad. I say that because if you look at the free cash flow on some of the Class 1s, you look at their debt, you look at their cash on hand, they have the ability to buy an autonomous trucking, even in this climate. Do you think that could potentially happen? Because then you have the sustainability benefits of intermodal, and then the autonomous truck, this is a bad term, but the last mile, even though it's going to be a lot further than the last mile, do we see some scenario like that potentially down the line?
I think it's possible. I think it's like, because there's a lot of synergies, and because, as you said, like these intermodal companies, they have a lot of money, and then they're willing to expand, but then like geographically, it's very hard to expand. It's very hard to scale a network, the intermodal network. So that might be one of the avenues in which they expand. And then we have these complementary services between autonomous trucks and intermodal, and not just competition.
It'll be interesting. BNSF, Burlington Northern Southern Santa Fe, wholly owned subsidiary of Berkshire Hathaway's building that big facility out in Barstow, California. So I could see you're running drayage from the Port of LA, San Pedro, Long Beach to Barstow. You're getting on the trains and you're going to, say, Chicago, for example. And then I could see autonomous trucks doing routes, hypothetically, to Vegas, to San Diego, running those really interesting routes in California. But before they can even contemplate that future, you have the regulatory environment in California. Last year, Governor Newsom vetoed AB 316. Thank you, Governor Newsom, for standing on the side of the California economy and doing right. Now we have a new bill going through the California Assembly and Senate, that would effectively ban AB trucking in the state. And around the time of AB 316, you wrote one of the most brilliant LinkedIn posts I've ever read. And I'm going to quote you here word for word because it's really impactful and it's really important. You wrote, the following, end quote, "In 1589, William Lee of Calverton, England, invented a knitting machine for the production of stockings, which imitated the movements of hand knitters. This was the first major step towards automating the textile industry, a process that 200 years later led to the Industrial Revolution. When Lee presented his invention to Queen Elizabeth I, hoping to obtain a patent, she refused, fearing the effects of the hand-knitting labor. Lee later moved to France with his workers and, most importantly, his machines. Was the Queen's decision at that time the right one? Or put differently, can we live without knitting machines today? In my opinion, this has many parallels to what's happening today in California with autonomous trucking. End quote. Absolutely brilliant, Mazen. The Industrial Revolution led to an increase in employment, productivity, and wealth. It was good for the economy. History is once again repeating itself. You have this economic argument from history, a very valid one, pro-innovation, pro-jobs, pro-economy, but yet here we go. History is repeating itself once again in California. Why do you think history always tends to repeat itself or to rhyme with itself?
The point here is that you can't hinder innovation all the time. So maybe you can stop it in some parts of the world. Maybe you can hinder it for some part of time. But if the market sees value in that, if the industry sees value in that, eventually it will come maybe in other states or in other time frames. I think there's a misconception here that introduction of autonomous trucks is like a flip of a switch. So suddenly we turn on autonomous trucks and then overnight all the human drivers' jobs will disappear. And that's just not the case. So this is a process that will take years or decades. I've heard people say that if you're a driver today, you'll probably still be a truck driver by the time you retire. Even if you're joining today, you'll still be a truck driver by the time you retire. So there's a misconception about the speed at which this will start competing at scale with human jobs. As I said, at Uber Freight, we believe in this hybrid network. We believe that both autonomous trucks and human drivers will be needed for a very long time. Not only because the technology might be slow to expand, but also the unit economics might still favor drivers on some lanes compared to AVs. In addition to that, there will be a lot of new jobs that will require human involvement. Think about inspections, think about the terminal operations, maintenance, everything that comes with an autonomous trucks. So there will be a shift of what type of jobs are needed, as well as the optimal mix of these jobs. But I wouldn't say we will see a wholesale elimination of some type of jobs anytime soon.
Jobs are going to be created from autonomous trucking, point blank. You are right. If you start a career today as a truck driver, you will retire a truck driver. There's a need for them. So you have this outrage in certain pockets, in certain sectors about autonomous trucks, but the Uber Freight model is the right approach. It is hybrid. There's no way around it. It is hybrid. And then on the other side of automation or autonomy, you have battery electric trucks. Technically, it could reduce jobs because there's not as many components, but it will create jobs because of different maintenance and the new technology. But there's not that outcry there. Why do you think there's a giant disconnect when they're both new technologies? They're both going to have a positive impact on the economy. They're both going to create jobs, but yet there's an outrage on one side, but not on another side. Do you think it's just individuals are not really looking at the data, trying to understand it, and they have their preconceived notions?
I think it's with an electric truck, you still need a truck driver. And that's when you look at that in isolation of the rest of the consequences, that's just one of these psychological effects. You tend to focus on catastrophize one of the effects. But yeah, hopefully both of the technologies will create new jobs. Both of the technologies will disrupt the industries as well. They will eliminate some jobs, create new jobs. And that's the way things have been going for a long time now. So if you think about the knitting machines, they've eliminated some jobs, they've created new jobs, but we haven't seen that taking place in a very short period of time. Of course, that takes place over a very long time span. Even knitting machines, they were not adopted at the same time they were introduced. At that time, it took centuries, more than decades. Now we expect it to take decades because the adoption curves are getting steeper and steeper. But still, it won't mean that this is something that will have immediate effects on the job market. Neither technology will have an immediate effect on the job market. If you look at the EV projections, the electric truck projections, maybe in the optimistic scenarios, we're seeing that by 2040, we'll start to see some meaningful market penetration. But this is a long process. This is not also an immediate process either.
Let's look at recent history for an example around job creation from electrification. Tesla, look at how many jobs Tesla's created. Yes, they have the factory in Fremont. They have the corporate jobs. They have the AI program jobs at the dojo. I can go down the line. So that's created hundreds of thousands of jobs, not to mention the amount of wealth it's created, the positive benefits on the community. And let's go one step down. Look at the Tesla ecosystem. You have upfitters, you have wrappers, you have repairer individuals, you have servicers, you have individuals that build products just for the Teslas. Oh, you don't want to get dog hair on your seat? Well, I built this thing and I'm going to sell to you. And that's creating jobs. That's a really great close example for creating jobs. And then you have Rivian as well that's created a lot of jobs around electrification. You have GM with their Ultium plant that's creating jobs. VW with the Chattanooga plant creating jobs. I can go down the line of all the jobs that have been created in the clean economy and the battery economy. So those jobs are created. That industry, yeah, it's in a turbulent time right now, but it will be a big part of the global economy going forward. And now the attention is starting to shift to Class 6, Class 8 heavy-duty trucks from an electrification standpoint. Daimler Truck has a very big program around electrifying Class 6, Class 8. Volvo has a program around it as well. PACCAR has a program as well. So does Traton, Navistar. We can go down the line. They're all shifting towards electrification of heavy-duty Class 6, Class 8 trucks. Fine and dandy, well done for building the trucks. But the introduction of the trucks, a lot has to go into that. Mazen, what has to happen to introduce the trucks into fleets? They could build the world's greatest electric trucks, but a lot of work has to go into actually putting the trucks into use.
That's a great point. And then at Uber Freight, we're having conversations with both carriers and shippers and like a lot of other players in the freight industry as well. We're seeing a ton of interest on the shipper side. So every day when we're talking with shippers, they're asking us, what about electric trucks? When will we be able to use electric trucks? When can we haul electric loads? When can we reduce our carbon footprint? And even some shippers are willing to pay a premium for that. So they're willing to pay more for electric trucks than a diesel truck for the same load. We're not seeing the same interest yet on the carrier side. So carriers are still hesitant to buy these electric trucks because they're saying, we don't have infrastructure, so where are we going to charge? We can only serve these maybe local hauls if we have like a charging depot, less than 100 miles, 150 miles. That will limit our schedules a lot because we need time for charging. We need to like find a way to optimize that within the limited hours of service we have within a day. So that will impact their efficiency as well. So because of all of these constraints, add to that the extra premium associated with buying an electric truck, carriers are hesitant to adopt these as well. So what needs to happen? I would say that first we need infrastructure at scale. We also need to start rethinking about how we think about regulations, like let's say hours of service. Can we make them more accommodating for driver schedules when they need to account for charging times? So we need to start thinking about like how we incentivize drivers. I know we have like some tax incentives in the IRA and the Inflation Reduction Act. So we need more of these.
And then you have the weight issue. We're going to have to figure out a regulatory, I'll use, to compromise around the weight issues if we want to decarbonize. As I said earlier, 18 billion of freight under management that Uber Freight has. Are you using that data with your partners to map out potential EV charging locations on certain lanes?
Yes, definitely. We are doing that. Sometimes, let's say electric carriers reach out to us and say, we have electric trucks, we want to put them to use. We know that in this area where they have these electric trucks, we have shipper X moving loads that are compatible with that. So we can connect these carriers to these shippers. And that's what we plan to do in the near future. Identify these short hauls which are applicable for maybe like what we call local hauls, in a way that a truck can complete a trip and come back to its depot to charge without stopping to charge along the way. And that's usually in the range of like 150 miles or so, maybe like 200 miles at most. So we identify these types of hauls, and then we identify which shippers have them, where is capacity available, and we try to match the two. So we are already doing that at Uber Freight.
What lanes do you expect to get electrified first? Will it be in California because of the CARB regulations, or will it be in Georgia or someplace that I haven't thought of yet?
So first, because of the absence of infrastructure, we're not looking at like long lanes. We're not looking at traditional freight lanes. We're looking at more at like local freight within a city or within markets. Unfortunately, we found that that's not enough. So in our data, even if you electrify all the local freight in every single market in the US, like when we look at the big markets, New York, Atlanta, Chicago, and we try to electrify all of these, these are like a quarter of all of our loads. So they're like a huge percentage of the loads. But when you look at what percentage of miles is that, that's only like 3% of the miles. So even if you could electrify every single market in the US, but you do not connect these markets, let's say on the interstates or the highways, it's not enough because you're left with 97% of the emissions, 97% of the miles. Yeah, in the future, we expect a stepping stone, which is local freight electrification, but the end goal is really to electrify the long distance freight. When you look at lanes, I think there's like a few strong candidates. And let's start thinking what we need to look at. We need lanes that are dense enough, that have enough freight that justify investing in infrastructure. We need lanes that have a lot of end-to-end volume. So, for example, if you look at Dallas-Houston, the Dallas-Houston corridor, most of the freight going on that corridor is going from Dallas to Houston or Houston to Dallas. Compare that to like Dallas-San Antonio. Maybe it has more freight, but then most of that freight is like cross-border freight going to everywhere in the US. You get more advantages here of electrifying a corridor like Dallas-Houston because it's more convenient for electric trucks to serve these loads. So these are like a couple of considerations. And then that's if you think about it myopically, but then you can think of it like long-term as well. Think of it like as building a network of like adding one corridor to the network at a time. And then you end up with this network with a lot of dense short-haul freight in between it. A few examples are if you think of like Chicago, Milwaukee to Indianapolis to like this area around the Great Lake, there's a lot of cities with a lot of freight between them. Similarly, you can think about like New York to Baltimore to Harrisburg, like Philadelphia. There's a lot of freight there as well. And then some cities around the Atlanta area as well, like Atlanta to Savannah maybe. There's a lot of cities with a lot of freight between them. So I think this will be great candidates for electrification because you can maximize the amount of miles that you can electrify compared to your investment and how much infrastructure you provide.
My father-in-law, steel guy from south side of Chicago, Gary, Indiana, the home of steel. I've toured steel mills. My father-in-law was very, very kind to take me there. A lot of steel goes out of there going from Gary, Indiana to Pittsburgh. It's a very big steel route because of U.S. Steel in Pittsburgh and Gary with the mills. We have the weight issue. I'd love to see that decarbonized, but we have steel weighs a lot. Do you think that perhaps from a regulatory environment that there could be an exemption on certain lanes for certain products because of the positive benefits going to have on the environment?
I hope that issue will be addressed in some way, either with the technology or with regulations, because that's one of the barriers facing shippers. So I spoke about like how shippers are very excited about this. They want to see EVs. They want to ship to hold their loads on EVs. But then we tell them that, hey, what if that impacts your tonnage or maximum weight? Are you going to like willing to split a shipment into 2 shipments or like maybe like 4 shipments into 5? Are you willing to do that? And then we started seeing some hesitation there. Like this is extra cost for us. So that's one of the reasons that shippers might be hesitant about adoption as well, even though they remain super excited. And we hope to see that address as well.
Right, because think about this. I'm going to put my father-in-law's shoes on. He's got to send 4 trucks instead of 2 trucks. I'm not going to say what he would say, but let's just put it this way. It'd be a Warner Brothers cartoon. There'd be smoke coming out of the ears just based on the economics there. What impact do you see electrification having on the rates? Will they be able to pass through the cost, or where's this going to fit from an economic standpoint?
So we've seen that some shippers are willing to pay premiums, which is a good thing. So some shippers are saying, like almost half of the shippers we surveyed at Uber Freight, they say that, yes, we want electric trucks. We want to reduce our carbon footprint. Even if it costs us more, we're willing to pay premiums for that. I think we quantified it at about like $90 per load on average. But it's a meaningful when you compare it to a dollar load, let's say like $1,400, just like throwing average numbers there. It's like 8 or 9% premium there. On some lanes, this will not be needed at all. So maybe on some local hauls, on some short hauls, we'll not see a cost increase between electric trucks and human-driven trucks. There's, like, of course, the cost associated with buying the truck itself. But as the technology matures, that total cost of operation or the lifetime cost of operation, that gap is closing. So in the future, hopefully, we might not even need premiums on many lanes.
If there was no premiums for electrification, you'd probably see, I don't have economic data back up, you probably see 30, 40, 50% depending on the weight could go over to that. If you're going to ship chips or light stuff, yeah, you can say, or toilet paper, what KBX is doing, for example. We're laying that out, but then I want to get back to the infrastructure. Where does the funding come from? Who funds the build out of the infrastructure? Is it a public-private partnership? Is it through tax incentives? Where does the funding come to build out the infrastructure?
I think it's going to be both the private sector and the public sector. We will see a lot of public sector grants. Maybe we expect to see these grants. We've seen a lot of public sector investment so far in the passenger side. Like 75,000 miles of highway are expected to be electrified. This will electrify like maybe like all the major highways in the US, or at least the interstate ones. There's also a lot of private investments. We're seeing like private companies reaching out to us, working on infrastructure, on like different innovations. We partnered recently with Green Lane on that, so they're working on developing infrastructure as well. So it's going to be both. I would say that even if both are working on this, I think having coordination is a must to ensure that we have that optimal spacing, like spacing, to cover the whole network in the most efficient way. And in addition to that, to guarantee that the grid is ready for EVs as well.
The grid's going to be key. So 1.2% of roadway length in the United States is interstate miles, but yet 55% of those of the freight goes on interstates. Is interstate, if you want to, let's start, we have the single, double, triple that McClellan from Covenant uses. To get the single, do we want to start by putting the infrastructure on the interstate, since there is a 55% volume of freight going on those roads, and start from there?
Yes, definitely. I think electrifying the interstate is key to electrify long distance freight and to start moving that needle. Like as I said before, like local hauls are not enough to move the needle. Maybe they account for like just 3% of the total miles driven in the US. But then if you electrify a corridor, let's say like Los Angeles to San Francisco, like the Texas Triangle, maybe these like four corridors might have more miles. These four interstate corridors might have more miles than the entire local freight market in the US.
Well, let's get to the economics of truck share, both battery and traditional diesel. In Q4 2023, truck sales fell 5.9% and were 8.1% lower year over year. What's causing that decline?
It's again the freight cycle. So when the market is tight, a lot of carriers will order a lot of trucks because they need trucks. They need to add their capacity because the rates are high. They need to make that extra cash. And then when the market is soft, they reduce their ordering. And then there's always a lag between ordering a truck and receiving it. So that has ranged between like 6 months, maybe in a good market, in a soft market for shippers, to about like maybe like 20 months in the tight market. When the market was extremely tight and during COVID, carriers had to wait for almost 2 years when they order a truck until they receive it. So there's always that lagged effect. And we saw that truck orders, they always follow tracking rates. They always follow where the market is at. And by the time that capacity hits the market, sometimes it's too late already. So right now we're seeing that truck orders have been lower last year. They were lower by about maybe like 30% year over year. And then sales started to follow. So when orders decrease, sales will decrease after a few months as well because of that lag. And that's exactly what we're seeing. We expect these sales to continue to decrease given the soft market we're in until the market starts to reverse. That's when we expect to see that orders will start to increase again, and then sales will follow. So it's the cycle again.
Do you see sales decreasing through the middle of 2024? And then if and when the Fed cuts later half of the year, you have a lag there. Perhaps in October, November, December, you start seeing an uptick then, because then the first rate cut should have hit the market by that point?
That's the expectation. We expect to see sales continue to decrease, at least in the beginning of 2024. I would say like the Fed rates are one of the factors, but also like this depends on whether we see a freight recovery as well, a recovery in freight rates, a recovery in freight volumes as well. So it all depends on that. But the expectation, at least for the beginning of 2024, is that sales might continue to be soft.
What would cause a freight recovery? What should we look for signs of a freight recovery?
We are already seeing some signs of that. Maybe not strong signs that will bring us back to where we were in 2021, the end of 2021 or the beginning of 2022, when we called it a freight Armageddon. Like literally everything was going wrong with the freight industry. Carriers were rejecting a lot of freight. There was not enough drivers. There were a lot of ships waiting at the ports. So we call that a freight Armageddon. So we don't see us getting back to that scenario anytime soon. But there are some signs that a recovery might be on the horizon. Let's say I mentioned the increase in consumer spending on goods. That's one of the signs. The manufacturing sector seems to have found the bottom. Maybe like it has contracted for about 2 years. If you look at the latest ISM report, it was about 49.1. That's the highest in 15 months. That's very close to 50, which is like that bottoming point. If you look at inventories, wholesalers' inventories, retailers' inventories, they were extremely high in the past 2 months, in the past 2 years, and they have been decreasing. So retailers and wholesalers are both working on destocking. That will be an additional boost to demand. And then we look at the supply side, fewer truck orders, less employment, especially when you look at long distance truckload employment, it's decreasing. It has been decreasing month over month for a while now. All of these signs, like more demand, less supply, are pointing to like some signs of a freight recovery. Maybe like Q1 is a weak quarter, so we shouldn't expect to see that maybe in Q1, because traditionally seasonality cools off after the holiday rush. But then with the end of Q2, that's when seasonality kicks in with the produce season, the freight produce season. And that's when also we expect to see some signs of the lagged effects of higher demand and lower supply. So maybe that would be the time where we should expect to see a freight recovery.
Yeah, well, it's very clear. You made a very intelligent economic standpoint. We have a lot to look out for over the coming quarters. Let's have you back around May, June, when we have more data to look at. We have a better outlook from the Fed. We'll see where the freight market is. We'll see, are we on the road to recovery? Hopefully, knock on wood, we are on the road to recovery in the freight market. So we'll have you back then to dial into that aspect of the data. But for today, Mazen, as we look to wrap up this insightful conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away with them today?
Yeah, Grayson, I really enjoyed this conversation. I think one of the key takeaways is that when you look at EVs and AVs, so far we've been focusing a lot on the technology, but it's also important to look at these in the broader context of where do they fit in this ecosystem, the freight ecosystem? Where do they fit in terms of the broader economy? And what are the impacts of what's happening in that ecosystem as well? What's the impact of what's happening on the economy? Because it's all related. It's always interesting to look in this broader context of these technologies because it will definitely have an effect on them.
Look at everything. Don't just look at one piece of data. Look at all pieces of data and come to your own conclusions. Perhaps you can be a mini economist, or if you're young, you can grow up to be like Mazen and be an economist for a world-class company, Uber Freight. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is Uber Freight. Mazen, thank you so much for coming on the road to autonomy economy today.
Thank you, Grayson. I'm looking forward to see you again.
If you've enjoyed listening, please kindly rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Road to Autonomy, or email podcast@roadtoautonomy.com. The Road to Autonomy podcast is produced by the Road to Autonomy LLC. The views and opinions expressed in the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect those views of the Road to Autonomy, its subsidiaries, its shareholders, directors, investors, or partners. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only. It should not be taken as legal, investment, tax, or business advice. Nothing is a recommendation that you purchase, sell, or hold any security or other investment, or that you pursue any investment style or strategy. The content of this podcast is presented on an as-is basis with no warranties, express or implied, of any kind. Financial mentions about companies in the Road to Autonomy Index and discussions about the Road to Autonomy Indexes are for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon when making any investment decision. Furthermore, an inclusion of security within the Road to Autonomy Index is not a recommendation by the Road to Autonomy Indices, LLC, to buy, sell, or hold that such security, nor is it considered to be investment advice.